Story 1. Children leave the house for the day without being in constant contact with their parents. Story 2. Send a little kid into the bar down the block to buy a pack of cigarettes from the vending machine. Story 3. Driving without seatbelts was common. In Europe, new cars did not have to come with seatbelts until 1971, and only in the early 1980s did European Union countries start to enforce seatbelt use. Story 4. My school district expelled pregnant girls. I lived in a rural area. If you lived on a dirt road, your school bus stop could be as far as a mile away, about 1.6 kilometers. Most bus stops were half to 3/4 of a mile from home. We walked in all kinds of weather, and girls were not allowed to wear pants even in winter. Very few children were driven to school by a parent. If you lived in town, you could walk home for lunch, but you were expected to be back on time for afternoon lessons, even at the age of 6. Story 5. Living in an offline world. You only know what you can remember. Story 6. Calendars and posters of nude women on walls in blue-collar workplaces were common, and the magazines from which they came lay on the tables in break rooms. Story 7. Schools have changed a great deal. Strict discipline back then, and I am not referring to corporal punishment, would be unacceptable by today's standards. Students of different genders sometimes learned different subjects in physical education and technology classes. Story 8. Dropping in to see friends without calling first was not reserved for holidays either. People would just show up for visits and be offered cake and coffee. Story 9. My great-uncle is 97 and taught English in a Glasgow school for his entire life. When he started teaching, the staff room had a chalkboard tally for the number of beatings given to children in the 1950s, and one teacher was proud to be at the top. Story 10. Parents hitting children with a belt and a school teacher flicking and striking students with a ruler. Story 11. I was struck by how common littering was. My family taught me not to litter, so it was jarring to see how many people would casually throw wrappers, cups, bags, and other items out of car windows or leave things behind in parks and movie theaters. I had forgotten many of those behaviors until I watched Mad Men. There were no seatbelts, people held babies while driving, people rode in the backs of trucks, and many other unsafe practices. Story 12. Reasonably priced concert tickets were common in the 1970s, which, as far as I can tell, is not the case in 2024. Story 13. Teenage groupies lined up outside a rock star's dressing room. Story 14. Having to actually talk to your crush on the phone while their entire family listens from the other room. No thanks. I'll stick to my anxiety-inducing typing bubbles. Story 15. I would go into a corporate office and ask to speak to a manager to request an opportunity to interview for a job. I heard more than once from a baby boomer that this was what I should be doing during my job hunt when I was in my 20s from 2004 to 2013. Story 16. Chasing a secretary around was dismissed as boys will be boys rather than treated as attempted rape. Story 17. Unrelated adults disciplining children they perceive as misbehaving. Story 18. Buying a television guide to see which shows were coming on that week and on which channels. Story 19. Forcing pregnant young girls to give up their babies for adoption. Story 20. Laws discriminating against gay people. The United Kingdom law changes in 1967 are commonly described as legalizing homosexuality. However, they retain several prohibitions. Anal sex and oral sex could still be considered illegal, threesomes were prohibited, 2 men could not have sex in a public place including a hotel room, and the age of consent was 21, 5 years older than the heterosexual age of consent. In 1994, the age of consent was lowered from 21 to 18, but this was still not equal to the heterosexual age of consent. Equal age of consent was achieved in 2000. Laws that could make threesomes illegal were removed in 2000. Amendments to remove the offenses of gross indecency and boogery were made in 2003. In Australia, homosexuality was decriminalized state by state after 1974. Story 21. The frequent use of spanking in schools. Story 22. Burning leaves in the street gutter every fall. There is nothing like that smell to take me back. Story 23. Small kiosks in the parking lots of larger businesses or shopping malls where people would drop off photo film for developing then later pick up and pay for the developed prints or slides. The most well-known name I recall was Photomat. Story 24. Playing outside unsupervised all over the neighborhood by yourself or with a group of kids at age 6 was typical in the 1970s. The junior high school in the 1970s had a cigarette vending machine. Story 25. Stereotypical advertisements aimed at women, such as those for kitchen products, and beer advertisements aimed at men that include lines such as, "She may have burned dinner, but at least the beer is right." Story 26. In the United Kingdom, homosexuality was banned in the armed forces. It was an actual question during interviews. Do you realize it is an offense to be homosexual in the Royal Air Force, the Army, or the Navy? This changed in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Story 27. Actually, before September 11th, I sat in the pilot's chair in the cockpit with my hands on the wheel for a goofy picture. All in good fun. Story 28. Students were exposed to teachers' cigarette smoke in the lunchroom during mealtimes. Story 29. We drank from the hose and rode our bikes for miles, from the suburbs to downtown and to the beach for unsupervised swims at a young age. We brought a note from Mom that read, "Please give Saturn a pack of Cool 100s. He may buy a Three Musketeers with the change." She did not want to miss her soap opera. Story 30. Locking girls and women in institutions because they became pregnant. Locking young boys in borstalls for extremely petty crimes and leaving them there for decades while profiting from their slave labor. The good old days can stay exactly where they are. Story 31. 90% incremental tax rates were applied to the top income bracket in the United States under the Eisenhower administration, which was beloved by conservatives. Story 32. 15-year-olds dating people in their 20s. That is what my grandmother did with my grandfather, and the family was okay with it. Story 33. Remembering your friends' phone numbers. $5 a carload drive-in movie. Cruising the main street and racing. Getting in fights at school and not getting arrested, shot, or stabbed. Making out on the quad in the open without being hassled by anyone. Story 34. A big one would be racism in most places. Not the large white supremacist displays, but everyday comments such as, "Oh look, a racial slur. Haven't seen one of those in a while." Story 35. Telling racist and homophobic jokes in public without caring if anyone overhears you. Story 36. When I was born, it was normal. If it happened now, it would feel really strange to me. Story 37. A glazed ham with pineapple and a bowl of canned fruit cocktail, among other unappetizing foods, are being served at a soiree. Story 38. Serial killers were widespread in the 1970s, and many were not caught for decades. Examples include the Green River Killer, the killer nicknamed Bind, Torture, Kill, the Hillside Strangler, the Boston Strangler, and the Night Stalker. Today, with extensive surveillance and technology, it is difficult to get away with murder for any extended period of time. Story 39. I used to be on planes where people smoked. I never thought it was odd until it was banned. Story 40. In the movie 16 Candles, the protagonist grows tired of his girlfriend. She gets drunk and passes out, so he allows another guest, the geek, to have sex with her while she is unconscious. The film treats this as something that happens at parties, uses it as a comic subplot, and frames it as a victory for the geek. The next day she wakes up, realizes what happened, and, although she does not remember the events, the film presents her as having liked it. This film was rated PG-13. Parents strongly cautioned, some material may be inappropriate for children under 13. Yet many of our parents let us watch it. John Hughes's films helped define Generation X's upbringing, but this film's treatment of sexual assault and its racism should be left in the past. Watch The Breakfast Club or Pretty in Pink instead. Story 41. A father, a mother, and 3 children live in a 3-bedroom house with 1.5 bathrooms that is about 1,100 square feet. Story 42. Republicans advised the president to resign for breaking the law. Story 43. In Germany, men were required to sign their wives' work contracts. Story 44. As a minor, you could purchase cigarettes. There were cigarette vending machines, or your parents wrote a letter authorizing the store clerk to sell you cigarettes. Story 45. You had to be at home to watch a television show and stay near the phone if you were expecting a call. You had to plan everything in advance because once you walked out the door you were uncontactable and out of reach. You also had to plan your money in advance and make sure you had enough cash to last the weekend. Do not forget to get to the bank before it closes. Story 46. A 6% return on a savings account at a bank and no monthly fees for checking accounts. Less sugar in food. A college education that holds actual value, costs less than a starter home in the Midwest, and is not necessary to earn a living wage. Doctors who actually want to cure your problems. Inexpensive accommodation for temporary residents in big cities. Story 47. Leaving the doors of your house unlocked and trusting that no strangers will enter. Story 48. Just imagine. Before video stores, before inexpensive and commonplace videocassette recorders, before home video releases, before digital virtual discs, and before streaming, the only ways to see a movie were in the theater or, if you were lucky and subscribed, on television through home box office, which launched in 1972. For most people, when a movie left theaters, it was gone. Story 49. I was talking about how short little girls' dresses were in the early 1970s. I had one and was so self-conscious. Watching an episode of Bewitched reminded me. Tabitha was wearing a sailor dress that exposed her underwear. Story 50. Racism. I do not think people realize the extent of racism and discrimination 50 years ago, and most school districts, particularly those in conservative states, are certainly not teaching children the true history. Story 51. In my generation and social circle, where I am 33, a father who does not change diapers would receive a lot of criticism. My husband and I were talking about this yesterday. Both our fathers have openly bragged about never changing a diaper, but if one of our friends did that, the other men would criticize him heavily. Story 52. Songs about 16-year-old girls. She is 16, beautiful, and cherished. Story 53. In my country, there is a lack of contraception. You need a general practitioner to get condoms. Story 54. He was looking through the Sears catalog to get his jollies. The gig was up when all of his mother's friends started calling each other about the man on page 602. Story 55. 1974 to 1975. Women going braless. White girls and a few white men getting their hair permed so they could have an afro. Men in burnt orange polyester suits. Story 56. Driving without a seatbelt or owning a car without seatbelts. Story 57. Memorize phone numbers and addresses, or write them down. Story 58. Command, familiar, escape, consist, shy, scary, grandiose, sink, exultant, advise. Story 59. Casual use of racist words. The slur for black people was all I heard as a small child. I did not know it was not the proper word for black people until I started school and my new best friend told me it was not nice and that it hurt her feelings. The same was true for the slur for Hispanic people of all backgrounds and for the slur directed at gay people. Story 60. Back then it was common and expected to be able to fix your own car. Story 61. Putting people in the back seat of a car with only a lap belt. I was 10 in 1988 when my brother and I were in the back seat and we had an accident. The forward impact bent us at the waist against our lap belts and we could not breathe. We were only winded, but it was horrible. Today, we would have been better protected with 3-point seat belts. Story 62. My parents bought a house in 1970 at 18% interest. My father had to get loans from his boss, his mother, and the bank. Housing was not affordable. Story 63. Climbing trees, playing outside with your friends, riding your bike to school, not getting your way, making harsh jokes, getting spanked, signaling left or right turns, ethical politicians actually talking with people. This list is endless. Story 64. Nut allergies and other food allergies were not recognized, and people died. Story 65. How normal it was to make fun of gay people. That was still so common even in the 1980s. Story 66. Letting kindergarten children walk to and from school without adult supervision. Story 67. Stay-at-home mothers were more common in the 1950s, when fathers typically worked and mothers stayed at home. This still occurs today, but less often. Story 68. You send your 8-year-old alone to the little store to buy 2 packs of cigarettes and allow her to get some candy with the change. This has happened so often that a note is no longer needed. Story 69. Doing all your homework by hand, writing a 10-page report for school, and getting a hand cramp. Story 70. A grown man in sweatpants with a mustache brought jump ropes to elementary-aged classrooms and jumped around with the kids. Our creep in the 1980s was a hacky sack player who took us all to the park to play frisbee. Those years were wild. Story 71. A doctor speaking to your husband about his wife's health problems instead of speaking to the patient is not compliant with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Story 72. When I was in kindergarten, I walked about half a mile to school alone or sometimes with other kids. I had to go past my grandmother's house on the way home, so 3:15 was time for a quick stop. In grade school, a mile from home, we walked every day and had a policeman walk us across a busy street. After 3rd or 4th grade, we rode our bikes. Speaking of hitchhiking, when I was in Vietnam, we would always hitchhike because we did not have cars, and any truck driver was generally happy to have another gun in the cab. Roads were not safe to walk, and walking 15 miles on unguarded roads was putting a target on your back. Story 73. A woman who needs her husband's permission to open a bank account. Story 74. Fat shaming was common. I have an old women's magazine, such as Ladies' Home Journal, in which a woman wrote that she stopped being called a fatty. Joan Rivers fat-shamed Oprah on The Tonight Show. Being brutal about calling people fat was normal and seen as something people had a right to do. If you were fat, you were considered offensive to the general public. Story 75. I was about to make a joke referencing domestic violence from the 1930s, then I realized 50 years ago was 1974, which triggered an existential crisis. Story 76. The idea of wifely duties was not criminalized in the United Kingdom until the early 1990s. Before that, a man could pressure or force his wife and there was little that could be done. It is a grim point, and it shocked me how late that legislation came into force. Story 77. Using a phone book or Rolodex. Taking a Polaroid of your penis and showing it to the girl you fancied. Story 78. Beating and raping your wife and admitting it publicly resulted in no consequences. Story 79. Weather, run, enjoy, lavish, squalid, party, library, cover, somber, wine. Story 80. Being spanked or having your face slapped by an adult neighbor. Then slapped again by another neighbor who did not know why but believed you deserved it, and later going home to be beaten because the neighbor said you needed discipline. Story 81. Adults could smack misbehaving children, not just their own. Story 82. You were standing with your nose against the chalkboard in class. Story 83. Marital rape was only outlawed in 1991 in the Netherlands. Such a decent little country. Story 84. Children run through town until the sun goes down with no supervision. Story 85. Working a 10 to 12-hour day and cracking open a beer or two on the drive home. Story 86. There was a significant amount of racism on television here in the United Kingdom. This was in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I was young, but it was clearly racism. Story 87. The free-range manner in which people raised their children. Story 88. Wired landline home phones. Story 89. College dorm floors were segregated and had curfews. I would have been so much happier if that had not been the case. Story 90. Letters. Getting a letter now means someone has your home address. Story 91. Children playing outside and walking to school without parental supervision. Story 92. Smoking behind the nursing station in the emergency room bothered me, but non-smokers' concerns did not matter. Story 93. 1975. 3 channels, maybe an ultra-high-frequency channel or 2. Dad had a shortwave radio. We biked everywhere. I had my own 12-inch black and white television and the $6 Million Man television show. Going to the library to get a book. The gas crisis. Dad drove a 1966 Pontiac Parisienne two-door with bucket seats. Driving to Florida with no air conditioning every August. Standing on the hump and your head hit the ceiling in the back seat. Lap belts. A penny on the turntable. 45 revolutions per minute records. Grandparents mailed you presents at Christmas from overseas. A telegram from grandmother. Getting mail and writing letters. Waiting for the school bus in winter and the snowbanks were way above your head. Stubby beer bottles. We had to dress for Christmas dinner and the family photo. Super 8 films and a super bright light that blinded you. 5 and dime candy stores. Black balls and clackers. Cap guns, Tonka toys, chemistry sets, doll houses. Party lines. Rotary phones and the long extension cord from the kitchen. Jello 123. Pop cans with tabs. Leaded gasoline. Smoking everywhere. Story 94. Children and other passengers in cars not wearing seatbelts. Story 95. The drinking age was 18 in my state, but it was more of a suggestion than a rule. You could have a drink with your parent in a bar or restaurant even if you were underage. I think you still can, by the way. Story 96. Smoking in public occurs in hospitals, restaurants, airplanes, and grocery stores. Story 97. Pretty much everything. It was common to see pregnant women holding cigarettes and drinks. Riding in the back of trucks with friends, even on highways, did not draw a single glance. Seatbelts were virtually unknown. Smoking in restaurants and on airplanes was commonplace. Driving while half-lit, often while smoking a cigarette with a car full of children, was the norm and no one batted an eye. Story 98. Young children run together in random areas and do not return home until late in the evening, and their parents do not appear to be concerned. Story 99. We let children roam the neighborhood unsupervised until the streetlights came on. No cell phones, just pure trust in the universe. Story 100. I used to go camping with my dumb buddies in the woods, sometimes overnight or for the weekend. None of our parents really knew where we were. We were not at a campground most of the time, just out in the woods, miles from the nearest pavement. We all carried guns and knives. If someone today came across a group of feral 13-year-olds in the middle of the woods with guns and no adults, they would call the police immediately. Story 101. People used to hold their babies while riding in cars, at most using a carrier that today would look like a doll carrier. Story 102. I don't know if it's shocking, but men used to go shirtless in public a lot back then. Story 103. Talking on a wall-mounted telephone with no caller identification. Story 104. My mother told us that when she and her sisters were children in the 1960s, it was common for them to drive to the pub in the United Kingdom, give the children packets of crisps and bottles of lemonade, and sit in the car unsupervised while their parents drank in the pub for several hours. Presumably, my grandfather drove them all home drunk afterwards. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.